Okay, we've just started the recording. Today's topics are a new way of studying sentence correction and some basics on verb tense. The usual warnings about problem submissions. Please don't submit things that are too general. Please don't submit things that are too specific. So how do I solve geometry problems? Too general, much too general for a study hall. How do I solve problems faster? More to the point, if your question is too specific, please post it on the forums. This is why we have forums. So if you're just asking about one problem and you're not generalizing the question in any sort of way, then please post the question on the forums. Also, personal issues. If you're submitting something like, these are my scores, these are the schools I want to apply to, tell me a study plan, we do have a place for that, but the study hall is not the place for that. The place for that is, again, in the forums, this time in the general folder of the forums. Ideally, topics of intermediate depth that tie into a more general question. Also, you must cite the source of whatever problem that you're citing. Original source. So forums don't create their own problems, so please don't cite a forum as a source. Please cite the original source. Also, no problems from the OG. Not okay. It's a copyright problem. Here are some, also please check the archives. We're still getting submissions for things that are already in the archives. So if you go to the sign up page and if you scroll down, you will find a wealth of archives of old sessions here. So please check that out before you send in a topic submission. We can't respond to all topic submissions individually because we get, hundreds of them. So basically, if you submit something that's already in one of our previous sessions, we will not cover it because it's in the previous session. Again, you saw these examples last time, but here are some examples of things that we won't use because they violate these guidelines. These kinds of questions are too specific. These are perfect questions for the forum. Someone posted just one sentence correction, or one question about one page in the strategy guide, or one math problem. These are not appropriate study hall questions. That's what the forum is for. Also, you need to, if you're going to submit a problem for the study hall, you need to include the problem with all the answer choices. These people did not include answer choices. You got to tell us where it's from, and you have to ask some sort of question based on it. These ones down here, overly general topics, we get this a lot, but I mean, some people submit stuff like, can you explain what's not in the OG? Well, we do try. That's what we try to do in every session. How do I do critical reasoning? Well, that depends on the type. What are the math and verbal strategies we use? That's everything we do. Personal study plans or advice, this is where you should go with these general folder on the forum. So this is an appropriate question, just not for here. This is an appropriate question for the forum general folder. And then again, we can't use OG questions. Okay, so these are your guidelines. These are the kinds of things you should not submit. Smiley face if you guys understand these guidelines, and then we will get going. Okay, smiley, let me see some more smiley faces here. I only see about 4 or 5 of them. Remember, the smiley face button is over there. If you understand the guidelines, please give me the button. Okay. So, the first thing we want to talk about, as promised in the opening screen, is a new way to try studying sentence correction. And as far as, I know sentence correction tends to be troublesome for a lot of people, so what I want to do in this first segment is to put forward a method that I've used with private students to a certain degree of success here. So let's talk about this. A new way to study sentence correction. Breathe some life back into all those OG problems you think you've seen 1,000 times. Okay, first of all, what I want to do is, before we talk about this in particular, I want to have a little brainstorming topic where you guys can type into the text box. So let's think about the following issue. for a second. The issue is this. Actually, I'm going to give you issues, plural is more like it. I'm going to give you some items to think about and give you a little bit to think about it and have you type responses in the text box. The issues are basically this. Many people get very confused by sentence correction problems. In particular, I'll put in red. Many people miss the same sentence correction problem multiple times. I'm sure some of you in the audience have had this unfortunate experience. In other words, even after studying the problem, they go back and miss it again. And then also many people feel overwhelmed by sentence correction problems, especially if the sentences are longer. Here's the question that I'm opening the floor to, and let's see if you guys can kind of piece together what we're going to say here. The question is, especially with that middle point, why? See what you guys have to say about this in the text box. Like, what do you think causes people, go ahead and type some responses to this in the text box. What do you think causes this situation in which people miss the same problem a whole bunch of times in a row? What do you guys think? In other words, while you guys are typing, let me add one more thought to that. In other words, people have a hard time remembering the rules. I mean, okay, so I don't know if you guys can see what each other are typing in the text box, but most people are saying things along the lines of, we don't really understand the rule that is tested. That's true, although that's not really an adequate explanation for why people would miss the same problem more than one time in a row. Because if somebody doesn't really know a rule, then that would explain why that person would miss the problem. But it doesn't so much explain why they would keep missing the problem over and over and over again. So let's see if anybody else has further thoughts on that. Because it's not just knowing rules and not knowing rules. There's more to it than that. See if anybody else has any other ideas. Subtle difference in answer choices sometimes, although a lot of the times the differences are pretty black and white once you understand what the differences are. Could be trusting your ear too much, although again, those are mostly reasons why. Let me go ahead and type this over there on the right-hand side. Because the things you guys are typing are valid, but they, so if you don't understand the rule, or if you use our ear too much, or if it's this is some of the things you guys are typing in the text box, don't understand the idiom or idioms. These are all true. I mean, these are issues that people definitely have, but the claim I'm going to make about these issues is that these issues are adequate explanation for why people miss the problem the first time. But they don't really explain why people keep missing the problem. Because I know a lot of you guys are very, very good about studying all these different aspects of the problem, and you post the problems on the forum, and you're very thorough about the whole thing. So it's not really just these things. So in order to get at this, I'm going to use an analogy. Part of it is that someone typed in the box the wrong grammatical if English is your second language. Although native speakers of English have a similar but different problem. Native speakers of English also have incorrect instincts a lot of the time because the written sentences are not the same as spoken sentences. Here's an analogy. Here's an analogy. The analogy we're going to use is because sentence correction is a complex skill. Now let's talk about how to build up complex skills by using an analogy. In other words, the question is, how do we build up complex skills? Okay, one example of a complex skill. Another complex skill that people might do is boxing, the fighting sport. How do people learn to box? And that's a very vague question, but this is a question that will definitely give you some insight into the situation. How do people who have never boxed learn to box? People who've never really been in fights or boxed. Yeah, boxing, the sport. The fighting sport. Let's see what insights you have. What practice and training? Now let's talk about what sort of practice and training. What do they do first? So yeah, you decide to hate the opponent. Okay, you may, whatever gets you motivated. And there's an analogy there with deciding to hate the GMAT. The question is this: what they don't do first. Okay, Sarah K1 is starting to get at what I'm getting at here. What they don't do, at least what they shouldn't do first. What they should absolutely not be doing first is just step into a ring and try to actually fight an opponent. That's just not going to work. So MP says learn the basic fundamentals. All right, now we're getting somewhere. Let's talk about this. What they should do first. How many basic fundamentals at a time should people learn when they are first learning to do this? One at a time. The first thing you need to do is learn and master the basic fundamentals, one at a time. So you guys might be starting to see where I'm going with this analogy. If you don't, believe me, we will explain it in detail. So in other words, what people do when they first learn to box is they learn to throw punches without worrying about anything but throwing punches, one at a time, many times in a row. So they'll learn to throw a right jab, and they'll throw 100 right jabs in a row. Then they'll learn to defend against punches, one at a time, many times in a row. And then what our boxers will do is they'll learn footwork, one aspect at a time, many times in a row. And the point of this analogy is that it takes these people a very long time to be able to step into the ring for the first time, because they need to learn these fundamentals first. And until the fundamentals are down, there's really no point in trying to integrate them. So then try to integrate these fundamentals, which are mastered individually first, into a fight. And it's only after they've learned them individually does this make any sense. Because it's too complex otherwise. If you took somebody who has never fought before and throw them into a boxing ring, it'll be a disaster and they'll never learn anything because there are way too many things going on at once. That's the problem. There are just too many things happening. That's why they shouldn't do this first. Way too many things to learn. You know, you can't learn 10 things at once. It's really impossible. So if it's a skill that you've never done or that you haven't done much of or that you just don't have some sort of degree of mastery at, the way to approach it, as boring as it is, I mean, this is not fun. It's not fun to walk into a boxing gym and then hit a bag 100 times in a row with your right hand. It's not fun. But the only way that anybody learns to box is by doing just that sort of thing. Does anybody know where this analogy is going? What does this have to do with sentence correction? See if you guys get the insight here. There you go. So the problem with sentence correction is, again, sentence correction is a complex skill. And, I mean, trying to solve, for people who have trouble with sentence correction, trying to solve whole problems is a lot like trying to walk into a boxing ring and just randomly try to fight. All right, so we'll get there. We'll get what this means. In other words, there's just the problem with sentence correction is the same thing as the problem with boxing. The problem is that there's too many things. If you try to learn too many things at once, you wind up learning nothing. That's the problem. So if you've got a sentence where there's an idiom, and there's a verb tense problem, and there's a parallelism issue, and there's a bad pronoun, and there's a meaning error, and there's this, and there's this, and there's that, if you try to learn all of that at once, you will learn nothing at all. Because people's brains are not really that good at multitasking. I mean, it's the same. People are only able to pay concentrated attention to one thing at a time. So the solution, and we're going to get into how to do this on the next slide, but the solution, and again, it's not really going to be very enjoyable, we'll talk about how it works in a second, is to ignore the whole problems and concentrate only on one aspect at a time. I mean, here's what we mean. Let's do this on the next slide. So let me import these lines from the previous slide. Okay, so as we had on the previous slide, there. The solution is to ignore the whole problems and concentrate on only one aspect at a time. Let's talk about how to do this. So here's how to do it. Sorry, I had a little bit of trouble with font sizes here. Okay, here's how to do this. What you want to do is you want to pick one aspect of sentence correction that you're going to look for. Just one. So, for example, pronouns or parallelism or whatever else. Then, for each problem, just go through a very large number of problems. Look for only that type of error. Eliminate choices only because of that type of error. And then quit and move on to the next problem. And then repeat, repeat, repeat. There you go. This is going to be very, very, very effective in building your awareness of single skills on the sentence correction section, because it's a lot like, you know, hitting a bag over and over and over and over again with the same kind of touch. It's really pretty much the same thing. So let me show you what I'm talking about. Let's say that you decided to go over parallelism and you got the following problem. Does anybody see anything in this problem that is supposed to be parallel, or any signals of parallelism or any parallel contexts in this problem? Go ahead and tell in the text box. Okay, you've got comes and come is not an instance of parallelism. That's actually a subject-verb agreement issue. So again, we're just reviewing parallelism. This is the key. The point is not to be distracted by anything that is not parallelism right now. So if you were reviewing parallelism, you should notice the following things. First, the elements beta-carotene, vitamin E, and vitamin C should be parallel. I think I switched C and E. C and E should be parallel. Should be parallel. But this happens in all 5 choices. So you don't really have any eliminations here. But then you have 2 other things. You have this and that. Not in every single choice, but in many of the choices you do. So let's eliminate wherever that's not done correctly. So we've done some study halls on this sort of thing before, so I'm going to assume that you have the knowledge. If you don't have the knowledge for how to eliminate based on parallelism, then parallelism is discussed in the study hall for May 13th. Okay, so the signal is and. This and you've got these parallel elements here. So you've got inhibit the formation of plaque along the body's blood vessels as the right-hand parallel structure. In some of these choices, you have additional words. You have a they here, and you have a that. So in choice B, you have a they inhibit the formation of plaque along the body's blood vessels. The problem is you have a that are also found in these things. That's not parallel because this is a subject pronoun, they, and that is not a subject. That is a relative pronoun. It's a modifier. So you've got a modifier in parallel to an independent clause here. So this is not parallel. C, you've got inhibit to the right of and that's a verb. You've got no verbs here at all. Found is not a verb here. Found is a modifier. So again, you've got this is, that are also found is a modifier up there. Let me put this in smaller font. In the text box, we have a request to repeat this choice B. That's a modifier. That are also found in beta-carotene, vitamin E, and vitamin C as modifying compounds. But they inhibit the formation is not a modifier. That's a regular subjective verb. It's not parallel. In C, your parallel marker is and. So after and, you have inhibit the formation. That's a verb. But there's no verbs here. This is a modifier. You can't put a modifier in parallel to a verb. So also not parallel. D, parallelism's fine. You've got that are also blah, 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 and that do this. So compounds, that blah, 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 modifier, and that blah, 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 modifier. So this parallelism is fine. Here, again, this is sort of like choice B. You've got a subject and verb. They inhibit. So that's a genuine clause with a subject and verb. Subject and verb. There's no compounds found in there's just a modifier there. There's no verb here. So this is a subject plus a modifier. You can't put a modifier in parallel with a real verb. So this is also not parallel for the same reason that B is not parallel. Here you don't have, I mean, this is that. This is a modifier, so there's no parallelism issue here. So this issue just isn't present in this choice at all. So the point is that we would just kill choices B, C, and E, and then we would quit. Okay, for anybody else wondering, the same thing is in the text box. Found here is if you want to look this up, this is what's called a past participle. It's not a verb. I mean, found can also be a verb, but in this case it's not. Found in this case is like driven or shown or done, or it's one of those past participle modifiers, if you want to look that up here in the text box. There, if you want to look that up, you can look that up. Found is a modifier. So what you do is you just eliminate those things, B, C, D, and then check either in the back of the OG if it's an OG problem, or on the forums if it's a GMAT prep problem. And then you quit. And you move on. In other words, you don't worry about getting the final answer to the problem because you're not really there yet. You're not really at the point where you're worried about answers. You're at the point where you're just worried about fundamentals, and answers can wait. It's a lot like in our boxing analogy. Our hypothetical boxer who doesn't even really know how to throw punches yet should absolutely not be worried about winning or losing fights yet. And worrying about getting whole problems right or wrong is really the same thing. If you're at the point where fundamentals are difficult, you're not there yet. It's not something you should really be thinking about yet. So if parallelism was the topic of the day, you would do this. You would eliminate B, C, and D. I mean E. Thank you. Just testing you guys. So now you pass. You kill B, C, and E. Thank you again. And then you quit. And you move on to the next problem. And you do this something like 100 times in a row. Again, I promised you it would not be fun. It's not fun to throw 100 of the same punch at a bag. It's not fun to look for parallelism in 100 problems in a row. But it'll make you a lot better at finding parallelism. So that's what I mean by repeat, repeat, repeat. Like, do not be afraid to go through literally half the official guide for each topic. Don't be afraid to go through as many as 100 problems or more. Because remember, in a lot of the problems, you're not going to see this. Like, if this error is not there, skip the problem. So, for example, if you're looking for pronoun errors, there are no pronoun errors in this problem. So if you got this problem during your review of pronouns, you would just skip it and you would move on. Let's say you came back the next day and you got the same problem during your review of subject-verb agreement. Well, now we're not paying attention to anything except for subject-verb agreement. So, hey, look at that. Comes and come. Comes is a singular verb. Come is a plural verb. So you just notice. Notice the difference between comes, which is singular, and come, which is plural. Number two, you eliminate, so you find the subject. If you don't know how to find subjects of verbs, you can check out our strategy guide, or you can check out our 9-session course, session number 2. Find the subject, then eliminate, and then you quit. Move on. So the subject is health benefits. If you don't know how to find that, again, you can check in your strategy guide, or you can check out session number 2 of our 9-session course. So health benefits is plural, so you want the plural verb. So this is going to be bye-bye choice A, and this is going to be bye-bye choice B. And that's it. And then you would be doing this in the middle of like 100 other problems where you're looking for subject-verb agreement. And this is really how you get better at these kinds of fundamentals. You have to focus exclusively on them. You know, and I mean, if you really want to push this boxing analogy to the hilt here, it's kind of like that. I mean, the analogy here is give a rookie boxer lots of videos of fights to watch. And just like tell him or her, if it's a her, to watch all of them, looking only at, say, footwork. Then watch all of them again, looking only at, say, shoulder movements, etc. I mean, you can watch the same videos a million times, but if you look for something new, it's like having new videos. So you can go through these OG problems literally 10 times. You can go through them looking for pronouns. You can go through them again looking for parallelism. You can go through them again looking for subject-verb agreement, etc. These are not OG problems, by the way. These are GMAT prep, because I'm not allowed to put OG problems on the screen. But you will find, okay, I promise you this will be boring. It will really, 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 really be boring. It will be like awful. It'll be like doing airport security where you have to watch 500 suitcases coming through the X-ray machine. But if you do it, you will get a lot better at whatever you're looking for. Does this make sense? Smiley face if you guys get this sort of approach. And if you're willing to try it. I mean, there are always some people out there who are very set in their ways and are not really willing to try this sort of thing. let me give you a couple of warnings. Okay, because on the forums we have a lot of posters who really, really like answers. I mean, they almost don't even care what's happening in a sentence. They just sort of say, oh, what's the answer? What's the answer? Is it B or is it C? You really have to be process oriented here. So a couple of comments. The text box question, GMAT Prep is the practice test that you download from the official website. It's the questions that are in the software. So those are the same. A couple of comments. Number one, you have to be willing to be unconcerned with answers. In the same way that our hypothetical boxer can't be worried about winning fights when he's just stepping into the ring and punching a bag. It's the process that you're concerned with. Because in most cases, you're going to eliminate only a couple of choices. And then you're going to quit. Like notice when we saw this problem with parallelism, we got rid of B, C, and E, but that's not enough to solve the problem. It's just getting rid of 3 choices. And then we quit because answer is not the point. The point is the skill. The point is parallelism. Then when we do this with subject-verb agreement, we eliminate 2 choices and then we quit. That's the deal. That's what happens here. So, as far as questions in the text box about difficulty levels, when you do verbal problems, you should never really be thinking about difficulty levels. They don't matter. It's not relevant to any sort of skill that you're going to develop. So, okay, that's comment number 1. You have to be willing to be unconcerned with answers. And then comment number 2 is do not forget to include meaning as one of your topics. Lots of exclamation points. A lot of our students are overly concerned with grammar and not concerned enough with meaning. And this is a really, really, really big deal because meaning is huge. So in other words, you have to have one run through where grammar is not even the point. So in other words, one of your run-throughs should be ignore grammar completely and just eliminate the sentences that don't mean the right thing. So, for a lot of people here, that's going to be sort of painful, but a lot of people think only about grammar and ignore meaning, and you can't do that. Meaning is an essential part of these sentences. There you have it. So in a lot of private lessons, I've had a lot of students get much, much better at identifying aspects of these sentences by doing this sort of approach. Is it easy? No. Is it terribly interesting? No, it's very boring for a lot of people. But it works, and it definitely will get you better at these kinds of things. So yeah, anything that is a topic, redundancy, sentence structure, run-ons, fragments. Concision, not so much, because concision is not an error. So that's not really worth doing. But yeah, redundancy, run-ons, fragments, meaning, a lot of these things that are not necessarily chapters in our strategy guide, but anything that is an issue with the sentence, you can do as a drill. Any questions about this kind of approach? If you have questions, go ahead and toss them in the text box, and I will try to answer them. But it's definitely worth trying, and I hope that not only the people who are here right now, but also anybody who's watching this recording is willing to give this a shot. It's really not very fun, but it'll produce results. Okay, I see a couple of you typing, so I'll wait for your questions, and then we'll start talking about tense. Okay, one person is no longer typing, but one person is. wait a few more seconds for the questions. Do you need to see sentence from other material? I don't really know what that question means, but the OG explanations are sometimes not the greatest thing in the world in terms of being clear, but they will, 90% of the time, they will mention the issues. Like, they don't forget them very often. So sometimes they use words that are not the greatest thing in the world. But placement of words would, the question is what about placement of words? That would fall under meaning, because usually when you shift words, or either meaning or modifiers, it depends on what words you're moving around. If you move words around that change the meaning of the sentence, that would be in your meaning drill. If you move words around and that makes modifiers different, then that would be in your modifiers drill. Maybe even both. I mean, you might run into the same issue as a meaning issue and a modifier issue. Gaurav, I don't really understand your question. How to summarize particular at the end of 2/3 of a day. I don't know what that means. So, what are the chances that the GMAT will ask questions that do not fall into the broad chapters? Well, everything should be in one of the broad chapters. Except, I don't know if we have a specific chapter about meaning, but our chapters of the guide pretty much cover everything that might be wrong with these sentences. Idioms, you can also do a drill on idioms. You can certainly go through 100 problems and look for nothing but idioms, absolutely. It's just like anything else. And if there is a wrong idiom, the back of the book will definitely tell you that there's a wrong idiom. So, no doubt about it. Okay, I think one more of you is typing a question, and then we'll move on to some stuff about tense here. But this is definitely worth trying. This is what I do with a lot of my private students, and in many cases, it's considerable success. So definitely worth trying. It's a lot better than trying to fight through entire problems. Like, I think you guys have probably experienced that. That's a very frustrating experience to have. Okay, I'm going to move on and talk about tenses. So let's do that. Verb tenses. Okay, we're going to introduce this topic by the following blanks. Here's some blanks for you to fill in. The tense of a verb is some percentage determined by grammar and blank percent determined by meaning. To the question there, yeah, the Manhattan material should be pretty much in sync with the OG. Like, I mean, if the OG mentions a modifier, go to the modifier chapter and check it out. If the OG mentions a parallelism issue, go to the parallelism chapter, and so on. Okay, try to fill in these blanks and in the text box. Give me numbers that you think go in these blanks. Notice that your numbers should add up to 100%. So, verb tenses. What do you think these numbers are? Strategy guides, yeah. Okay, anybody else want to guess these percentages? By the way, a lot of people are saying 100 and 0. If you're saying 100 and 0, you're not really thinking about this because, for example, if you say, I am in school, or my brother is in school versus my brother was in school, this is very clearly a meaning issue. If you mean that your brother is still in school, then you use this tense. And if you mean that your brother was in school, you use that tense. Like, that should be very obviously clear. So if you're saying 100% grammar, then you're saying that you don't ever have to think about what you're saying, which is not true. So be careful with that. The correct answers are 0 and 100. Not a joke. In other words, verb tense has nothing to do with grammatical considerations. Okay, grammar only determines whether something should be verb or not verb. But once you've determined that you need a verb, the meaning or context of the sentence is the sole determinant of what tense the verb should be in. All right, this is good news and this is bad news. This is good news because this means you only have to think about half the stuff that you normally think about. Because, for example, when you think about parallel structures, you have to think about grammar and meaning. Because with parallelism, if you watch that May 13th study hall, you'll know what I'm talking about. In parallelism, not only do you have to match up the grammars, but you also have to be putting things in parallel that are supposed to be in parallel in the first place. On the other hand, with verb tense, the good news is that you don't actually have to think about the grammar. Once you've determined that you're supposed to have a verb, then the verb tense is only determined by what you are trying to say. So in other words, the good news is in picking verb tenses, you only have to think about context and what is happening when in the sentence, i.e. meaning. You don't have to analyze grammar. All right, on the other hand, the bad news is that many of our students don't really like to consider the meaning of the sentence. So, the deal is that you basically have to get used to it. So again, here's what I mean up here. Grammar determines whether something should be a verb or not a verb. So going back to this example with the parallelism here, parallelism in this case is a grammar issue. For example, inhibit is a verb and found is not a verb. It's a modifier. So that's a grammar issue. You can't put a verb in parallel with something that is not a verb. Okay, smiley face, if that makes sense. So if it's a smiley face, if that makes sense, if it's a verb versus not verb kind of issue, that's a grammar issue. Okay, on the other hand, tenses you can't just look at from the standpoint of grammar. Tenses you have to look at from what are you trying to say. Very different issue. So let's talk about verb tense. And then in the spirit of what we were talking about earlier, of the earlier discussion of, the new way to do sentence correction, in the following examples, we are only going to discuss verb tense. In other words, we're not going to look at other errors. So we may not wind up actually solving all the problems. We may just wind up eliminating a few choices according to verb tense. But it'll simulate doing a drill like this one for verb tense. And you'll see how much more you can get accomplished when you basically pay attention just to one thing. You can look at it in a lot more context. So let's try it. Why don't you try? try this problem. Just look at tenses. So again, our job here is not to solve the entire problem. Our job is to just look at tenses. Pick the tenses, you make the decision, decide whether you think the verb tenses are correct or incorrect. Remember, you're just looking at meaning of the sentence. Don't answer yet. Just make sure that everyone has time. And after about a minute and a half, I'll call for answers in the text box. Remember, you're not answering the question, you're just looking at verb tenses. So here's a verb, here's a verb, had been harboring is a verb, were harboring is a verb. This is a modifier, and that's a modifier. Remember, INGs by themselves are not verbs. They're modifiers. If you didn't know that, now you know that. INGs by themselves are not verbs. They're modifiers. In this kind of, they can also be nouns, but you know, in this type of context. So those are verbs. Are as a verb. Are as a verb. Are as a verb. Are as a verb. Had been as a verb. Recently uncovered we don't need to worry about because it's the same in all five. Will enable is a verb. Enables is a verb. Enabling is not. Again, that's a modifier. And then finally, there's a ton of tenses in this one. Will be privy, was privy, is, will be, was. And even better yet, we've got would add and had added and all this other stuff. So, okay. I'll give you guys a couple of, there's so many here. I'll give you about 2 minutes to look at this. And then don't answer in the text box yet. Make sure everyone has time, and then we'll call for answers in a text box. I'll be back in about a minute and a half. Okay, let's talk about this. Let's talk about these tenses. The purple one's in all five, so let's talk about this. What do you guys think of that? Are and had been. Any comments in the text box? Any brave souls want to type in the text box first? Wait a second to see if you guys have anything to say about it. Okay. Let's try this. This is supposed to be are, and let me tell you why. Does anybody think that's weird? Because this is what's called the present tense. Now, what's interesting about this is that this stuff is not happening in the present. So you got to know what present tense means and what it doesn't mean. And ironically, even though it's called present tense, it doesn't refer necessarily to the present. The present tense actually doesn't usually refer to the present. Here's how it works. Because if you read this sentence, the sentence means that, okay, all of this is happening in the past. Like, we definitely know that because uncovered is in the past in all 5. So we definitely know that in the past, at some point, a watchdog group recently uncovered some trick. And it was a blow to people who still thought this. So basically, this is not true. Like, we know in the present that this is definitely not true. So why are we using the present tense? Well, let's talk about it. Here's how the present tense works. Despite its name, here's how the present tense works. It doesn't really refer to the present, weirdly enough, at least not necessarily. It's used to state general truths. It's used to state general actions or states that are not fixed in any time frame. So generalizations. Or general states that are currently true, like the United States is a democracy. Here are some examples. Blood circulates through the arteries and veins of the human body. This is a general truth. Like, this is something that is always true. Okay, notice that even if you are talking about a discovery of this happening in the past, you still want to, if this is a general truth, you should still use the present tense. So like in the year 1550, the Greek doctor XXXXX discovered that blood circulates through the arteries and veins of the human body. Notice this properly belongs in the past tense, discovered, because the discovery was actually in the past. But circulates, because this is a general truth that is still true today. You use the present tense for that. So, how about this? In 1987, Smith first observed that the Cuyahoga River was full of pollution, versus in 1987, Smith first observed that the Cuyahoga River is full of pollution. Why don't you guys let me know what you think of this? If you think these are both correct, say so. If you think it needs to be was, say so. If you think it needs to be is, say so. A couple of you are starting to get it. They're both correct. It depends on what you mean. Again, they're both fine, but it depends on what the sentence means. Okay, this is correct. This is correct if the river is no longer full of pollution. For example, if I say something like, in 1987, I first learned that the USSR, which is the Soviet Union, there's no more Soviet Union, right, was a communist state. I can't say is here because the Soviet Union doesn't exist anymore. This state is no longer generally true. On the other hand, this one is also correct if the river still has pollution in it. And pretty much will forever. For example, if I was a little kid in 1987, I wasn't, but in 1987, I first learned that the sun rises in the east. It would be incorrect to say rose here, because this is still true. The sun still comes up in the east. So, yeah, I mean, this is why I gave this example. So, all right, but the sun, so smiley face if you guys understand the difference. Like with the Soviet Union, I have to say was, because the Soviet Union doesn't exist anymore. With the sun rises in the east, I have to say rises, just like I have to say blood circulates, because these things are still true, and they're always going to be true. So this is what you use the present tense for. So smiley face if that makes sense. Smiley face button if you get that. Smiley face button. Okay, that's how you use the present tense. So this is, I mean, the reference is to people who believed that this was generally true. Like they believed that email exchanges are private generally in the same way that they believed that blood like circulates, or they believed that the sun rises in the east. So this is true. This one would mean that they believed that the email exchanges used to be private. That doesn't really make a lot of sense. Because had been would mean before this time frame. So the implication here is the people believed that at one time previously the conversations, the exchanges had been private. I mean, that doesn't make any sense, because, I mean, if you use a little bit of intuition about what the sentence is saying here, the sentence is saying people who still thought this is true were disappointed by this. Like, if they thought that this was already a past tense thing, they wouldn't have been disappointed by this whole thing. So we keep R, and this is incorrect. Okay. What about the gray stuff? What do you guys think about that? Text box. Notice that it's possible that that more than one of these might make sense. The only thing that doesn't really make sense here is was, because past tense means not anymore. So if you have a past tense verb, that basically means past. Like past tense is the one tense whose name really gets it right. Past tense means past. It's not true anymore. So this means, i.e., they aren't pretty anymore. In choice B, this one up here. That doesn't make sense. Same issue down here, i.e., they aren't privy anymore. So those are incorrect. Smiley face if you guys understand why was doesn't make sense. And again, I think you guys are starting to appreciate it's really cool that we don't have to think about grammar at the same time. Like, that's really nice. Because there's already a lot of stuff happening in this sentence. Like, the context is complicated enough as it is. If we had to think about grammar at the same time, that would be kind of nuts. The problem with was is that was means that they wouldn't get the comments anymore. If you say so that the person was privy, it would mean they were in past, like not anymore. This is a past tense verb. You know, it's like saying if I was able to run really fast means I can't run really fast anymore. So the difference between will be privy and is privy, you just have to be really literal about this. So will be privy means like in the future. That makes sense because the people haven't added comments yet. I mean, they won't see the comments until the person adds them, which hasn't happened yet. So will be privy also makes sense. So there you go. What about C? So this person is privy to any comments that a recipient would add. This is probably not as good, but this still makes sense in the this makes sense in the sense of the general truth sort of sense. It's probably not as good as will be, but it's not horrible. So we should probably keep it. All right. Now what about the blue thing? Had added, might have added, would add, might add, might add. Wait a little bit longer for you guys to give some feedback on this one. All right, let's talk about, so I mean, had added doesn't make sense, because if you think about the context here is once they rig the message, then they can start seeing comments. So once the interloper rigs the message, then he or she can see comments. So had added doesn't make sense, because that would mean that they would see the comments that were added previously. That's just that's nonsense. Let's talk about would and might. In particular, let's talk about would. Would is a lot more important than might. So let's take a look at would. Just a second. In fact, let's talk about would and could at the same time. Would and could. Here's a slide that you can look at real quick. It's going to take a second to load. Okay, here's how to use would and could. It's still loading on a couple of your screens, but I'm going to start talking about it. Two different incarnations of these words. The first is that would is the past tense of will, and could is the past tense of can. So Like you could say in the present tense, you could say according to his most recent advertisement, Bookie the Bookie can predict with 100% accuracy which teams will win next week's games. If you translate this into, those parenthetical comments shouldn't be there, let's kill those. If you translate this into the past tense, you get his October 2/82 advertisement declared that Bookie the Bookie could predict with 100% accuracy which teams would win the following week's games. So, yeah, you could call these auxiliary verbs if you really want to classify them, but just notice that if you put can into the past tense, you get could. And if you put will into the past tense, you get would. The other kind of would is what's called hypothetical. This is used if you want to look up more information on this. This is what's called the hypothetical subjunctive. Here are a couple more examples of it. If I were a millionaire, I would donate 800,000 hamburgers to the county food bank. If you're going to use this sort of would to be a hypothetical, then you have to use this in what's called the hypothetical subjunctive. So if I were, not if I was. So if you go back to this problem, you'll discover that neither of these work here, because this would, one possible sense of would is the past tense of will, but this only works with sentences that are written in the past tense, because we're talking about past tenses of things. So this only works if the appropriate part of the sentence is in the past. So notice this is actually in the past. It's in October 1982, and it declared. That's why this works. This is in the present, so it doesn't work. The problem is that this is as the message is forwarded. So if you discover that that is there, then this can't be the past tense of will. Because if this were the past tense of will, it would have to be as the message was forwarded. As the message was forwarded, they would add the comments. But if it's as the message is forwarded, you would have to say will add. So, or might add. It also can't be hypothetical because this sentence is not hypothetical. Like it doesn't say as if the message were forwarded to others. It's getting a little crowded here, but can't be hypothetical either because the sentence isn't hypothetical. If this said, if the message were forwarded, like any comments that a recipient would add if the message were forwarded, that would be okay. But you can't use the hypothetical would with is. It would have to be if the message were forwarded. Just like I can't say if I am a millionaire, I would donate. That doesn't work for the same sort of reason. So would doesn't work because neither of the two senses of would make sense here. So this is also incorrect. That leaves you with D. Might is a little bit more flexible, and as you're learning here, might happens to be okay in this kind of context. Any questions about this awful thing? There's a lot of lessons at once. Are they used to show? Gaurav, you'd have to give me some sort of context for that. But I mean, these things are pretty flexible. They do lots of stuff. So, okay, there's some questions being typed in the box, and we'll move on to another, finally another problem. Harboring and has, okay, yeah, had been harboring. Okay, that's, yeah, we forgot to treat that one. Harbored and were harboring makes sense because still at the time of the message. The time of the sentence is uncovered. So who still harbored, meaning at the same time, that works because it's simultaneous with uncovered. But had been harboring, that's called the past perfect. That's in our 9-session curriculum. That also works because this is ongoing up until that point. So both of those make sense. Like if you mean to make the point that they had been harboring up until this exact point, then you can say this. If you mean they were still harboring as this went on, that would work too. So they both make sense in a certain way. They're definitely, neither one of them is definitely wrong enough to eliminate. Still can, I mean, remember that tense is all meaning, so you're not going to have hard indicators like that. But it still lets you figure out what's happening in the sentence, and it can be useful. In this case, it certainly should help. Okay, try this right here. Let's see. This is another, by the way, all the problems on this study hall are from GMAT Prep. Okay, again, we're just looking at the verbs. Here are some verbs. That's a verb. Born by itself is not a verb. Born is another one of those past participles. It's a modifier. So if you want to look that up, you can look up past participle modifier. Have been attacked, had been attacked. Please don't put feedback in the box yet. Let everybody have a chance. Were attacked, had been attacked. And then were born is, that's a verb. Okay, let's try these. I'll give you about 1 minute to look at these verbs and decide whether you like the tenses or not. Please don't type in the box yet. Thanks. Let's take a look. What do you guys think of the blue verb? Type in the text box. What do you think makes? You can type what makes sense, or you can type what doesn't make sense. Okay, yeah, we definitely want, I mean, the people in the study are adults. So this wouldn't make any sense if they had not yet reached adulthood. So the people in the study are adults, i.e. they reached adulthood in the past. So therefore, it doesn't really make any sense to use a present tense there. So by the time they reach adulthood doesn't really make any sense. Okay, now give me some feedback on that green verb. In the text box. Have you got anything to say about the green verb? Go for it. Yeah, all right, well, let's look at the relationship. In A, it's the relationship between these two that doesn't make sense. If you look at A, either of these pairings would make sense. Either you could say, well, the question's in the text box, I'll try to get in a second. You could say, by the time they reach adulthood, they have been attacked. Or, and in fact, this isn't just in A, this is in general, either of the following pairings would make sense. Or you could say, by the time they reached adulthood, they had been attacked. So if you've seen our materials, you're probably familiar with these timelines that we draw to represent these tenses. So if you draw a timeline to represent the passing of time here, then the way these tenses work is if they reach adulthood in the present tense, then this is saying they have been attacked up until that point. So that would work in terms of a relationship. Ongoing. That's how have been works. Have been attacked. Or you can do this with the past perfect. This is the present. And then the use of these tenses is pretty thoroughly covered in our materials. So if there's any questions about the way these tenses are used. Reached adulthood. And then there's an ongoing action until that point they had been attacked. Or persisting up until that point. So these relationships would work. But the problem is that this is a study. I mean, these are data in a study. So this relationship makes sense. Like the relationship between these two tenses is logical. But remember how you use this present tense. This is a general truth. So it wouldn't make any sense for a study to show that. This is this would be kind of like blood circulates or the sun rises in the east. This would be a general truth, not the sort of thing that could be shown by one study. So that wouldn't make any sense. Like, notice you don't have to, there's no choice that pairs these two anyway, so you don't have to deal with this issue here. But if you had reach and have been attacked, it would make logical sense, but not common sense. Like a study can't show something like that. On the other hand, by the time this data set of people reached adulthood, we know they're adults because they're in a study. So they have to have reached adulthood already in the past. They had been attacked. This works. So that's the pairing of verbs that you want here. Had reached and attacked and have been attacked. This is not a logical pairing of verbs because this would mean that this happened after that. Remember, had reached happens before tenses like this. This doesn't make sense. The meaning of the sentence is by the time they were adults, these attacks had already occurred. So you need the right kind of relationship. So you want reached had been attacked. All right, were born is fine because were born is a past event. It happened once in the past, so this is fine. Using born as a modifier, also fine. Here's another instance of were born that we didn't see before. Notice again, born by itself is just a modifier, so that doesn't count as a verb. So if we're doing a verb tense coverage of this problem, we would stop here. We're left with C and E, but we're concentrating on verb tense, so we say fine. I eliminate A, I eliminate B, I eliminate D, and then I quit. Because we don't want to distract ourselves with 10 million other things. I mean, that's where you get to the point where sentence correction just becomes overwhelming. You know, C versus E, the rest of this is like these modifier issues. You'll get that next time. You'll get that when you go through 100 problems looking for modifiers. So, but in terms of tenses, there you go. Okay, we're about out of time, and by about out of time, I mean actually overtime. But let's do a little bit of review of what we've seen here. Remember that the verb tense is always meaning issues. Good news, bad news. By the way, let me, the questions that are in the text box. What is the greatest marker that you should tell you? You have to think about what's going on in the sentence. And that's what's happening in the sentence. You have to realize, just kind of using, you know, intuition, common sense, whatever you want to call it. Like, okay, we're talking about a study. A study has to look at things that have already happened because that's what studies do. So you have to know these people are adults already, so reached in the past and had been attacked before that. It's really just meaning issues are like that. You have to just grasp what is going on in the sentence and with your best intuition. Like, there are not really going to be systematic markers of meaning because there don't have to be. I mean, it's the same reason that when you're having a conversation with someone, then you don't need to look for markers to figure out what they mean because you can just get it. So if you're thinking too much in terms of grammar, it's easy to kind of turn off that common sense. But unfortunately, when you consider meaning issues like verb tense, you have to turn that part of your thinking back on. So it's not a very academic kind of thinking, but you have to use it, unfortunately. Okay, here's what we had seen before. Grammar is not a factor in verb tense. Meaning is everything. This is bad news because a lot of people need to start thinking outside the usual box, but it's good news because it's a focus, unlike other things where you're always thinking about both of these things. Verb tense, just a meaning issue. We saw some facts about would and could, and we saw some facts about present tense. Here's your would and could, 2 ways to use them. One way is past tense of will and can. The other way is hypothetical situations with this so-called hypothetical subjunctive. And we had a slide on the correct use of what's called present tense with these different examples. We didn't have explicit slides on the past perfect, present perfect, etc., because those items are in our strategy guide and in our curriculum. And the point of these study halls is to supplement, not replace, that curriculum. So for that information, you can go to our strategy guide on sentence correction and have a good time. But most importantly, back to our advice about how to approach sentence correction, big deal. You should give this a shot. And especially if any of you are the I've gone through the whole OG type of person, you'll find that this can definitely let you get more value out of that OG. Because I guarantee you have not gone through all of the problems in enough detail to have noticed everything. Right? There's just no way. So give this a shot. Try it. I mean, you may find that this study hall changes the entire way that you approach sentence correction problems. And then I should close with the following note. Just as, I mean, once you've done enough months of boxing fundamentals, then you can actually start fighting, obviously. the same sort of thing is true here. Like once you've done enough of these drills, then it's time to start doing whole problems. So don't use up all your problems. Make sure you have some fresh problems of some sort left so that when you're finished with your topic drills that you still have fresh material that you can slam at that point. So there you go. Okay, that's it for me for today. Thanks for attending. I'm going to cut the recording at this point.